What you see here is an example of a lesson for a hybrid course built on the CTL's single-page lesson template. For the record, this page is not part of a course here at Fanshawe. I made this as a visual aid to show what a lesson might look like, but for the record, I am not a chemistry professor at Fanshawe, nor have I developed a chemistry course. While we're going through this content, we're not going to read every word, but I will point out specific elements. If you'd like to read the lesson in its entirety, you can expand the view to full screen and pause the video for as long as you need before moving on. So, what you see at the beginning is an introduction to the lesson. It begins with a short narrative to hopefully pique the learner's interest. It then introduces the idea of the periodic table but goes no further than that. It then briefly, in plain conversational language, describes the knowledge learners will have by the end of the lesson. Next, we have an example of one approach to a pre-reflection. There are a ton of ways you can do this, but this one is a simple list of questions to get your learners thinking about the subject. This lesson would take place early in the course, and so my reflection questions do not ask students to reflect on content from an earlier lesson, but rather what they already know about the topic before being exposed to the course content. As we scroll down, next we have the learning tasks. The weekly structure for my hypothetical hybrid course is that they would come to an in-class session early in the week, then do some online learning, and then attend a practical lab toward the end of the week. There's a few important things I'd like to point out to you here. First, that I intend for my students to engage in this content in chronological order. The intention here is that my students have only a single place to go for all of the necessary direction on this week's lesson. Everything is here in one place. This week, I'm asking my students to start the week with watching a short video. Next, I'm being explicit about them attending class. With a hybrid course, it's important that we tell our students where in the timeline of the lesson the in-person class will land. Likewise, in Task 6, I'm asking students to attend the lab. This leaves no ambiguity for the student on the order of operations. The next thing I'd like to point out is that this is not simply a list of resources, but rather, you'll see I've added a little context for each point to help my students understand how that particular piece of content fits into the larger lesson and why they would benefit from engaging with it. This only takes a moment, but is hugely valuable for students, especially when they're looking at this content on their own, without you or their classmates present. Next, at the end of the lesson, we have a link to a summative assessment. I'll click on this quickly here, but we'll focus on the structure of this document in the future. Following the assessment, we have a conclusion that summarizes the lesson and hopefully gets students thinking about the future. And finally, an optional resource and this week's references. Next, we'll talk about what the lesson plans for the in-class and practical lab portions look like.